Singapore's National Day in 2000. The sounds of celebration couldn't mask a moment of deathly silence. When a group of carefree teenagers parted the tall grass and discovered a blood-soaked body, the entire nation was shaken to its core. This tragedy landed like a bombshell in every corner of Singapore, unleashing immense shock and widespread fear. Today's case is far from ordinary. It was listed among the 9 most horrific crimes in Singapore in the year 2000. At the crime scene, aside from a single key, investigators found almost no other clear clues, and the series of events that followed swept through Singapore like a storm, stunning the entire country. So what exactly happened back then? Let's travel back to the year 2000 and uncover the truth behind this bizarre murder case in Singapore. Singapore, as many of you already know, is a country we've covered several times on this channel, but in reality, it has always been an extremely safe nation. In the 2024 Global Peace Index, Singapore ranked 5th among the world's most peaceful countries, and it has repeatedly been named one of the most peaceful nations in the Asia-Pacific region. The laws here are strict, and penalties are severe. For example, littering in Singapore can result in a fine of up to 2,000 Singapore dollars for a first offense, and repeat offenders may be fined as much as $10,000. Under such stringent regulations, violent crimes are relatively rare, but even the safest places have their outlaws, and today's story is a prime example. The 9th of August 2000, Singapore's annual National Day. The entire nation was celebrating, with decorations everywhere and a festive atmosphere filling the air. Yet, in a forgotten corner of the city, a horrifying scene was unfolding. Near Chestnut Avenue in Singapore, close to a large nature reserve, the area was exceptionally quiet. That day, 3 middle school students were cycling past on their way to school for the National Day celebrations. The boys were laughing and chatting as they rode along, but when they reached a secluded stretch of road, one of them suddenly stopped. He stared intently at the grass beside the road and said, "There seems to be someone over there." His 2 companions looked puzzled. Who would be lying in the grass in such an isolated spot? Seeing their disbelief, the boy cautiously approached. The moment he parted the weeds, a blood-soaked body lay right before his eyes. The sight terrified him. He screamed and scrambled back. The 3 boys immediately called the police. Officers arrived swiftly at the scene. A preliminary examination confirmed that the victim was a middle-aged man. He had multiple bruises on his head and 4 distinct stab wounds to his chest, deep wounds, nearly all fatal. Based on the condition of the body, the time of death was estimated to be within 12 to 24 hours, but one detail quickly caught the medical examiner's attention. Despite the ferocity of the attack, the victim had almost no defensive wounds. Normally, when someone is attacked with a knife, instinct drives them to raise their arms to block, grab at the weapon, or try to flee. Yet the victim bore no such marks. The medical examiner therefore concluded that when the stabbing occurred, the victim was either already unconscious or physically restrained, unable to fight back at all. Because the crime scene was in a remote area, there were no surveillance cameras nearby. Police could only spread out in teams, searching the surrounding area with the discovery site as the center. Eventually, they found a key with a metal ring in a nearby bush. Apart from that, almost nothing else of value was recovered. Police then identified the victim through his personal effects. His name was Kiong, 42 years old, a taxi driver. He was married with 3 children, and his family life had always been stable. According to his family, on the morning of the 8th of August, around 6:10 a.m., Khoo had left home as usual to drive his daughter to school. After that, they lost contact with him. That evening, when his wife realized he hadn't returned and couldn't reach him, she filed a missing person report with the police. Little did she know that just one night later, she would receive the devastating news of his murder. Police interviewed Khoo's friends and acquaintances. The investigation revealed that he was a kind, honest, and family-oriented man who had almost never made any serious enemies. Police therefore ruled out revenge as a motive. At the same time, they discovered that Khoo's money and valuables had been stripped from him after his death. Combining these factors, investigators began to suspect that this was likely a robbery that had escalated into murder. The real breakthrough, they believed, lay in Khoo's missing taxi. His car was not found at the scene. If the killers had driven it away after the murder, then locating the vehicle might lead them to evidence left behind by the perpetrators. Police mobilized a large number of officers for a nationwide search on the 10th of August at about 4:55 p.m. The investigation finally made progress. Khoo's missing taxi was found in a parking lot, but when officers opened the car doors, they were quickly disappointed. Although the vehicle had been recovered, the killers had been careful. Almost no fingerprints or other key evidence that could directly identify them remained inside the car. Police staked out the parking lot for several days, hoping the killers might return, but nothing came of it. That single key found in the grass remained one of the few clues in police possession. But little did anyone know that 18 days later, Singapore would be rocked by an even more brazen murder, and that second case would finally give investigators the key, literally, to unlocking the first. The 26th of August, exactly 18 days had passed since Kiong's murder. While police were still struggling to solve the taxi driver's case, another brutal killing occurred in Singapore. This time, the caller reported that two men had shot and killed someone in broad daylight in a public area. That immediately escalated the seriousness of the situation. Singapore has extremely strict gun control. Ordinary citizens can almost never legally possess firearms. Now, with gunmen openly robbing and shooting people in a busy district, the news sent shockwaves through the entire country. When officers arrived at the scene, onlookers had already been dispersed. A middle-aged man lay on the ground, with gunshot wounds to his head and chest, surrounded by a large pool of blood. The victim was identified as Sadiq, 39 years old, a foreign currency exchange dealer. He was born in India and later became a Singaporean permanent resident. On the day of the incident, Sadiq had just finished work at the bank when he was attacked by two robbers shortly after leaving. According to witnesses, both suspects were armed with handguns. They threatened Sadiq and demanded he hand over his money and valuables. Even though Sadiq complied and gave them what they wanted, the robbers shot him anyway, killing him on the spot. Unlike Khoo's case, this murder occurred in a relatively busy area with heavy foot traffic and numerous witnesses. It quickly made headlines across all major media outlets. Within just 18 days, Singapore had suffered two brutal murders. The public was terrified. Many began to worry that they might be the next victim. Senior officials demanded that police solve the cases as soon as possible. But for investigators, the pressure was already immense. They still hadn't found a real breakthrough in Khoo's case, and now they had an armed robbery, homicide to deal with. Police had to push forward on two fronts simultaneously. According to eyewitness accounts, there were two suspects, both armed with guns. They had threatened Sadiq, taken his valuables, then killed him. Forensic teams recovered a bullet casing near the scene. Unfortunately, both suspects had disguised themselves. Although many people witnessed the attack, no one could clearly describe their faces. Police still couldn't identify them. Just as the investigation seemed to hit a dead end, Sadiq's family provided an important lead. Because of his work, Sadiq almost never let his mobile phone leave his side. He always kept it in his bag along with his cash, and that bag had been taken by the robbers. The family suggested a possibility: if the killer still had the phone, maybe police could trace it through call records. Police decided to give it a try. To their surprise, they found a breakthrough. Sadiq's phone was still being used. Whether the killers were careless or simply didn't take the police seriously, technicians traced the call records and eventually identified three suspects: 35-year-old Kamil, 35-year-old Ibrahim, and 30-year-old Rosli. The 15th of October, police moved in. To ensure a successful operation, they devised a highly covert plan, splitting into three teams to arrest the suspects simultaneously. All three were taken into custody without incident. Preliminary investigation confirmed that two of them, Kamil and Ibrahim, were directly involved in Sadiq's robbery and murder. Police then searched Kamil's apartment and made an unexpected discovery. Inside, they found a Smith & Wesson revolver, a Colt semi-automatic pistol, and 8 pairs of handcuffs. The firearms alone proved how dangerous this group was, but what really caught investigators' attention were the 8 pairs of handcuffs. Because when officers counted, they found only 7 keys for 8 pairs of handcuffs. One key was missing, and officers stared at the keys for a long time, growing more and more certain they looked familiar. Then it hit him. 18 days earlier, near the spot where Khoo Kiong's body had been found, police had recovered a key with a metal ring from the bushes. That key, which had never been identified, looked remarkably similar to these handcuff keys found in Kamil's apartment. Investigators immediately realized Khoo Kiong's murder was likely committed by the same group. Police then re-examined the movements of Kamil and the other two suspects. At this point, a friend of Kamil's provided another crucial lead. He said Kamil kept a locker at a shopping mall in Choa Chu Kang, where he often stored items he didn't want at home. Police rushed to the mall. Sure enough, inside the locker they found a bayonet wrapped in newspaper. This was no ordinary knife. It was a military bayonet about 13 centimeters long, razor sharp with a serrated edge on one side, designed to be mounted on a rifle. On the surface, the blade appeared to have been thoroughly cleaned, but technicians from the Health Sciences Authority still managed to detect traces of blood inside the handle. DNA testing came back quickly. The blood belonged to Khoo Kiong. The case had just taken a massive leap forward. Police then conducted further forensic analysis on the handcuff keys. The 7 keys seized from Kamil's apartment matched the key found at Khoo's crime scene in material, construction, design, and dimensions. More critically, the key found at the scene fit exactly the 8th pair of handcuffs that had no key in Kamil's apartment. The key, the handcuffs, the bayonet, and the bloodstains on the bayonet, all of it connected. The taxi driver's murder and the later armed robbery shooting finally pointed to the same group of people. With the evidence mounting, the other 2 suspects realized they could no longer hide the truth. To seek leniency, they gradually admitted their involvement in Khoo's murder. After months of dead ends, the taxi driver's case had finally broken wide open, but the case was far from over, because when the 3 suspects were brought before the High Court of Singapore, a far more troublesome question emerged. All 3 admitted taking part in the crime, but none of them would admit who actually decided to kill Khoo Kiong. After the 3 suspects were arrested, the case finally entered the judicial process. On the 18th of October 2000, prosecutors charged Kamil, Ibrahim, and Rosli with first-degree murder. Compared to Sadiq's shooting case, Khoo's case was far more complex to try. Sadiq's murder had multiple eyewitnesses and a relatively clear sequence of events, but Khoo had been killed in a remote location. No surveillance, no witnesses to reconstruct what had happened that day. The court had to rely on physical evidence and the 3 defendants' own statements. The problem was, all 3 told completely different versions. Each admitted they had taken part in the operation, but each tried to push the most serious responsibility onto the other 2. First, let's look at Kamil's account. According to his testimony, sometime before the incident, he had traveled to Thailand and purchased 2 handguns and a bayonet. On the morning of the 8th of August, around 10:45 a.m., he met Ibrahim and Rosli at a coffee shop near Bukit Batok. All 3 were short of money and unwilling to earn it through legitimate work, so they began discussing a plan to rob a gold shop. On the day of the operation, Kamil carried a revolver loaded with 6 bullets. He also equipped the other 2 with gear. Rosli's backpack contained a bayonet, handcuffs, a mask, and gloves. Ibrahim's backpack contained a pistol, handcuffs, a mask, and a hammer. Before the operation began, Rosli raised a key issue. They couldn't just flag down a taxi after the robbery. They needed to prepare a getaway vehicle in advance. The 3 decided to steal a car first, but after more than an hour of trying, they not only failed to steal a car, they also ran into a police patrol. At point, Rosli suggested another plan. Since they couldn't steal a car, why not just stop a taxi and take the driver hostage? After robbing the gold shop, they could release the driver. According to Kamil, he was still hesitating when Rosli and Ibrahim started flagging down a taxi. Soon, a taxi pulled over. The driver was Khoo Kiong. Ibrahim sat in the front passenger seat, while Kamil and Rosli sat in the back. Kamil originally wanted to head straight to Woodlands, where there were many gold shops and banks. But the other 2 thought they should deal with the taxi driver first, before the robbery, so they had Khoo drive to a secluded spot near Chestnut Avenue. After arriving, the 3 men threatened Khoo and ordered him out of the car. Khoo realized something was terribly wrong and kept telling them, "I can give you money. to intimidate him. Kamil pulled out his pistol and brandished it. Seeing the gun, Khoo got out of the car, but as he stepped out, he suddenly tried to run. Rosli immediately chased him down, restrained him with handcuffs, and dragged him into the bushes beside the road. According to Kamil, what happened next was completely outside his plan. About 1 to 2 minutes later, Rosli walked out of the bushes alone, holding the bayonet and handcuffs. With the bayonet covered in blood, Rosli told the other two that he had stabbed the taxi driver 3 or 4 times. In court, Kamil insisted they had only planned to steal the car. They never intended to kill anyone, but since it had already happened, the 3 quickly fled the scene. Afterward, Ibrahim drove Khoo's taxi to Woodlands with the other 2 inside. On the way, they took more than 500 Singapore dollars from Khoo's wallet and split it. The 3 still planned to rob a gold shop, but the murder had left them shaken. They decided to change their appearance first, buying new clothes, getting haircuts, before looking for another opportunity. While the other 2 were getting their haircut, Kamil scouted nearby gold shops. But everywhere he looked, he saw surveillance cameras. In the end, he abandoned the plan. They drove around Woodlands for a while, stole nothing, and returned. Ibrahim was tasked with disposing of the taxi and wiping it clean of fingerprints. Kamil and Rosli waited at a train station. After Ibrahim returned, the 3 even went to a movie together before splitting up around 5 p.m. that day. Kamil went home. He took a shower and planned to throw away the jeans he had worn during the crime, along with the bayonet. But he thought the bayonet was too expensive to simply discard, so he cleaned it, applied rust, proof oil, wrapped it in newspaper, and hid it in the locker along with another bayonet he had bought earlier. Later, the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. If police ever came knocking, that bayonet could be the key piece of evidence against him. And since it had already been used in a killing, keeping it made him nervous. He decided to get rid of one of them. But the 2 bayonets looked almost identical, and Kamil picked the wrong one. The one that actually bore Khoo's bloodstains stayed behind, and it was that very mistake that later led police to the crucial piece of evidence. Nevertheless, Kamil maintained in court he had only supplied the weapons. He did not kill Kiong. The one who actually did the stabbing was Rosli, but Ibrahim and Rosli gave completely different versions. Both of them insisted the one who planned the entire operation was Kamil. Ibrahim said Kamil had first approached Rosli, showing him 2 guns and proposing a robbery. Initially, Rosli was too scared to join, but after a few meetings, he gradually caved. Not only did he join, but he also brought Ibrahim into the plan, since Ibrahim was a better driver and would handle the getaway. According to Ibrahim, the 3 had started planning as early July 2000, and Kamil's original target wasn't even a gold shop. He had bigger ambitions. He wanted to rob the security guards transporting cash. On the 8th of August, they had waited near an ATM for their target, but later abandoned the plan because they spotted police. As for the taxi takeover and Khoo's murder, Ibrahim downplayed his own role, repeatedly insisting, "I was just the driver." Rosli's account was even more direct. He said Kamil was the one who proposed stealing the car. Kamil was the one who decided to take the driver to Chestnut Avenue. When they arrived at the secluded spot, Kamil was the one who pulled out his gun and ordered Khoo out of the taxi. When Khoo tried to run, Kamil handed Rosli a pair of handcuffs and told him to bring the driver back. Rosli admitted he dragged Khoo into the bushes, but he said he originally only wanted to restrain him, not kill him. Khoo begged for mercy, saying he had a family and children, pleading with them to let him go. Rosli claimed he started to feel reluctant, but then Kamil pointed his gun at him and forced him to act. Under that pressure, Rosli stabbed Khoo in the chest 4 or 5 times. Afterward, he retrieved the handcuffs, took Khoo's wallet, and returned to the taxi. Rosli said he was shaking all over, but Kamil remained cold and calm, uttering just one sentence: "This is his fate." Rosli painted himself as someone forced to kill under threat of a gun, a participant who had never truly intended to take Khoo's life. 3 men, 3 versions. Kamil said he only supplied weapons, and Rosli was the one who killed without authorization. Ibrahim said he was just the driver. The real actions were carried out by the other 2. Rosli admitted the stabbing but insisted Kamil had forced him to do it. Each admitted part of the truth, but each pushed the most serious blame onto someone else. But the court's task was not simply to decide who told the most lies. It had to determine who planned the robbery, who actually delivered the fatal blows, and if the other two knew the full scope of the plan and willingly participated. Were they also equally responsible for Khoo's death? The judge now had to reconstruct the true structure of the crime from 3 contradictory confessions, alongside the physical evidence, the bayonet, the pistols, the handcuffs, one piece at a time. Faced with 3 completely different accounts, the judge had to reconstruct the true criminal structure piece by piece from the chaotic confessions. Ultimately, the court established several key facts. First, Kamil was the mastermind of the entire criminal plan and the supplier of weapons. Second, Rosli was the one who directly stabbed Kiong to death. Third, from the very beginning, all 3 had shared the common purpose of committing an armed robbery, and their actions ultimately resulted in Khoo's death. That meant, regardless of who actually held the knife, all 3, as members of the same criminal conspiracy, could not easily escape responsibility. However, the defense lawyers naturally disagreed. Kamil's lawyer argued first. Kamil himself did not directly harm Khoo. He did not stab anyone, nor did he personally kill the driver. The fatal attack was carried out by Rosli. Therefore, the lawyer contended, even if Kamil had participated in the robbery, Rosli's killing should not be fully attributed to him. Rosli's lawyer countered with an entirely different argument. He claimed that if Kamil hadn't threatened Rosli with a gun, Rosli would never have stabbed Khoo. According to the defense, Rosli had only meant to restrain the driver and hide him in the bushes until the robbery was over. What turned the situation into a killing was Kamil's order and threats. As for Ibrahim, his lawyer tried to minimize his role. The defense argued that Ibrahim's only function in the entire incident was as a driver. He did not kill anyone, nor did he participate in planning a murder. The true decisions to rob and harm the driver were made by Kamil and Rosli. Therefore, the lawyer argued, Ibrahim should not be held responsible for murder. The 3 defense attorneys presented their cases vigorously, each striving to reduce their client's culpability. It is worth noting that Rosli's lawyer, David Reciv, would himself turn to crime about 5 years after this case concluded. He was later implicated in defrauding clients of approximately 11.3 million Singapore dollars and some gold bars. He fled the country in 2006 and became one of Singapore's most wanted fugitives. But that is, of course, a story for another time. Facing the 3 defense arguments, the judge ultimately delivered a very clear ruling first regarding Kamil. The court held that he was by no means a mere supplier of weapons. On the contrary, he played a central role in the entire criminal scheme. He provided the firearms, he prepared the bayonet, he distributed the handcuffs, masks, and other tools to his accomplices. Kamil handed the pistol to Ibrahim and the bayonet to Rosli. That act alone showed that he anticipated those weapons would be used in the robbery. Why else would someone go to the trouble of acquiring guns and a bayonet from Thailand, only to distribute them to his partners, if he only intended to steal money? More critically, the court determined that before the 3 even got into Khoo's taxi, Kamil had explicitly stated that the driver should be killed, and when Rosli dragged Khoo into the bushes and stabbed him, Kamil himself stood guard nearby, gun in hand. After Khoo's death, Kamil instructed Ibrahim to dispose of the taxi and wipe it clean of fingerprints. From preparation to the crime itself to the cover-up, Kamil participated in every critical stage. The court therefore concluded that he could not possibly be a passive participant. Next, Ibrahim. His defense hinged on 2 points. First, he hadn't personally killed anyone. Second, he hadn't known that Rosli was going to kill the taxi driver, but the court found neither argument sufficient to absolve him. Throughout the crime, Ibrahim remained at the scene and drove the getaway vehicle. In other words, from the start of the robbery to Khoo's death, he never left the group. More importantly, when Khoo was taken out of the car, clear signs of violence were already present. Rosli had a bayonet, Kamil had a gun, then Rosli, armed with the knife, dragged Khoo into a secluded bush. In that context, Ibrahim could hardly claim he had no idea the driver might be seriously harmed. The court found his "I didn't know there would be a killing" explanation to be a post-Fayhawk attempt to downplay his responsibility. Finally, Rosli admitted he had personally stabbed Khoo, but he repeatedly emphasized that he had only killed because Kamil forced him at gunpoint. The judge did not accept that explanation. After Khoo was pulled into the bushes, he had begged Rosli for mercy, pleading that he had a family and children. Yet Rosli still thrust the bayonet into his chest multiple times. Not just one symbolic strike, he stabbed him repeatedly, with wounds that were nearly all fatal. If Rosli had truly been acting under duress, merely going through the motions, there would have been no need for such a brutal and deadly assault. Moreover, after killing Khoo, Rosli clearly removed the handcuffs, took the wallet, and returned to the taxi. That sequence of actions showed he was not a man stripped of agency or forced into it against his will. The court concluded that Rosli's "Kamil made me do" it claim was essentially another attempt to mitigate his own guilt. The judge emphasized a critical principle in the ruling. When multiple people jointly commit a crime, every person who actively participates in the criminal plan may be held responsible for the final outcome. In plain terms, if you know that a criminal group is preparing to commit a serious crime, yet you voluntarily join and provide assistance to the plan, you cannot later escape liability by saying, "I wasn't the one who did it," or "Simone told me to do it." All three men knew this was a planned armed robbery. All three actively participated, and in the end, an innocent taxi driver lost his life. Therefore, the court held that all three must bear responsibility for Khoo Kiong's death. On the 5th of September 2001, after 19 days of trial, the High Court of Singapore delivered its final verdict. Kamil, Ibrahim, and Rosli, all three were found guilty of murder. What awaited them was the harshest penalty under Singapore law, death by hanging. Facing the death sentence, all three defendants expressed dissatisfaction and filed appeals. However, Kamil later voluntarily withdrew his appeal and accepted the court's judgment. Rosli and Ibrahim continued their efforts to overturn the original verdict, sticking to their earlier defense strategies. Rosli argued that he had only committed the killing under Kamil's gunpoint threat, and therefore should not bear the same level of responsibility as the mastermind. Ibrahim continued to emphasize that his role in the entire case was merely that of a driver. He hadn't personally killed anyone, nor had he participated in formulating a murder plan, but the court ultimately rejected these arguments. On the 18th of February 2002, the appeals of Rosli and Ibrahim were formally dismissed. The original verdicts were upheld. In fact, even if they had managed to secure a different outcome in Khoo's case, some of the defendants still faced responsibility for another serious criminal case, because the earlier armed robbery of Sadiq had also resulted in an innocent death. The two cases occurred just 18 days apart. In the first case, 42-year-old taxi driver Khoo Kiong had simply been going about his work when he picked up three dangerous passengers, only to be overpowered, robbed, and brutally killed. In the second case, 39-year-old currency dealer Sadiq was held up at gunpoint in a public area. Even after he agreed to hand over his valuables, he still couldn't save his own life. And what ultimately allowed police to connect the two cases was something as seemingly insignificant as a handcuff key. The key found near Khoo's remains perfectly matched the handcuffs seized from Kamil's apartment. The bayonet later recovered was found to have traces of Khoo's blood inside its handle. Combined with the three suspects' own statements, a case that had originally had no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, and almost no physical evidence was finally linked together in a complete chain. On the 25th of October 2002, Kamil, Ibrahim, and Rosli were executed by hanging at Singapore's Changi prison. And with that, this case, which had stretched on for more than 2 years, finally came to a close. Looking back at these two cases, they sparked a very extensive public debate in Singapore at the time, especially Khoo's case. For taxi drivers, picking up strangers at night or in remote areas is simply part of the job. Khoo Kiong had no way of knowing that the three men who got into his cab that day were not ordinary passengers. They had already prepared firearms, a bayonet, handcuffs, masks, and other tools. And before they even got into his car, they had already planned a serious armed robbery. He was just taking a fare, but he never made it home. On the other side, Sadiq's murder showed the public that even in a densely populated public area facing armed robbers, a victim's willingness to hand over valuables did not guarantee his safety. 2 murders occurring in quick succession triggered an unprecedented level of public vigilance against violent crime in Singapore. The public not only became more acutely aware of the cold faint-bloodedness and brutality of criminals, but also pushed for greater attention to public safety and law enforcement. A country can have strict laws, it can have a low crime rate, it can have an efficient police force, but that doesn't mean crime will never happen. Truly dangerous people do not automatically disappear just because the law is strict. So no matter what kind of environment you live in, maintaining basic safety awareness is never a wasted effort. And for Konoi Kang's family, the case was solved. The killers were brought to justice, and perhaps justice was served. But on the eve of National Day in the year 2000, a husband and father who had simply gone out to work as usual never came home. That, more than anything, is what makes this case truly irreparable. That is the story for today.